9 days after Harold Godwinson's fleet went home, lookouts on the Northumbrian coast counted sails. Not 80, not 100. Something closer to 300, running down the coast toward the mouth of the Tyne. The army that landed there was not Norman. It had sailed from Norway, and the man leading it was already, by the autumn of 1066, one of the most traveled kings in Europe. He had fought on the Dnieper and the Bosphorus before he ever set foot in the North Sea. His name was Harald Sigurdsson. The sagas call him Hardrada, hard ruler, though even that translation is disputed among the scholars who have tried to pin it down. England had spent a year bracing for William of Normandy. The first invasion to actually land came from somewhere else entirely. Every account of 1066 that stops at Hastings treats Harald Hardrada as a detour, a battle England had to survive on the way to the one that mattered. That gets the shape of the year backward. Of the three men who believed they had a right to England's crown that autumn, Hardrada was the only one with practical experience commanding an empire's soldiers. He had commanded the Byzantine emperor's personal guard, put down a Mediterranean rebellion, and stood close enough to a palace coup to help decide an emperor's fate, years before William had finished consolidating Normandy. Part 1 left the English coast unwatched. This is the story of who came through that gap first, and of a maneuver his own commanders would use to break an English shield wall twice in a single autumn, at two different rivers, under two different invaders. Hardrada's claim to England did not begin with him. It began 3 decades earlier, with a pact between two kings, who each ruled half of a shared ambition. Magnus the Good of Norway and Harthacnut, King of Denmark and England, had agreed that whichever of them died first, the other would inherit his crown. Harthacnut died in 1042. Magnus never collected on the English half of that bargain, tied up as he was in a war over Denmark instead, but he never renounced it either. When Magnus himself died 5 years later, the claim passed to his uncle and successor, Harald Hardrada. For 19 years as King of Norway, it sat unused. 1066 changed that. Edward the Confessor was dead, an English earl was standing in Hardrada's hall asking for help retaking his own province, and a claim nobody had pressed in a generation suddenly had a use again. That earl was Tostig Godwinson, brother to the new English king, exiled from Northumbria the previous autumn for the kind of harsh rule his own nobles would not tolerate. Heavy taxation, long absences, and the killing of political rivals. Harold, then still a subject himself, had sided with the rebels to keep the peace. Whether that made Harold a fair broker or a convenient traitor to his own blood is a question this series already sat with once. In Part 1, Tostig wanted revenge. Hardrada had an old promise and a large fleet. Neither man needed to want the same outcome for the alliance to make sense to both of them. To understand why Hardrada thought the promise was worth collecting, the record has to go back further still, to a teenager fleeing a lost battle in Norway in 1030. Harold was about 15 when his half-brother, King Olaf, was killed trying to reclaim the Norwegian throne. Harold escaped east, first to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Coup, then further still to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and in the 11th century, the richest city most Scandinavians would ever hear of. There he joined the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, an elite unit recruited almost entirely from Scandinavia and the lands of the Rus, and prized for a loyalty that came from having no local family to protect and no local faction to favor. The Byzantine chronicler John Skylitzes, writing from inside the empire rather than from Iceland 2 centuries later, confirms the broad shape of what came next. Harold's Varangians fought across the eastern Mediterranean for most of a decade, putting down a rebellion in Bulgaria, campaigning in Sicily under the general George Maniacs, and capturing by one account some 80 fortified positions along the Euphrates. In 1042, the Varangians under Harold's command found themselves at the center of a palace revolution. The Empress Zoe's adopted heir, Michael V, tried to push her aside. Constantinople rose against him, and the Guard was in the middle of it. Harold was said to have played a direct hand in Michael's downfall. He was in his late 20s, protector to an empress, and by some accounts, a serious candidate for the throne itself. He never became emperor. What he left behind is smaller, stranger, and still there. High in the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral the Emperor Justinian had built 5 centuries earlier, a Scandinavian guardsman scratched a name into a marble parapet. Only part of it survives, the last 4 letters, enough to identify the name as Halfdan, a Norse name. Nobody knows for certain whether this Halfdan served alongside Harald. He served in the same guard, in the same building, in roughly the same decade, and his carving has outlasted the empire he was guarding. Harald left Byzantium not long after, married Elisiv, daughter of the same Yaroslav who had sheltered him as a fugitive teenager, and traveled back through Kiev to Norway. In 1046 he became king, and minted the country's first true national coinage, a silver penny stamped Harald Rex Nor, ending Norway's dependence on foreign coin. It joins a thread this series has followed since part 1, where a wartime king's only surviving portrait was the coin he had the confidence to mint. There is no statue of Harald, no mosaic, no manuscript painting made in his lifetime. There is a coin and there is a name carved by someone else on a wall in a city he had already left behind. On the other side of the North Sea, Harald Godwinson had been king for a little over 8 months, and none of them had been restful. He had spent the summer with a fleet at the Isle of Wight and a levy strung along the south coast, watching for the invasion Part 1 left approaching. 9 days after that muster finally broke up for lack of supplies, word reached him that a different fleet had landed in the north, at the mouth of the Tyne, and moved onto the River Ouse near York. Harold's own brother was with it. So was a king whose claim was considerably harder to dismiss than a Norman duke's disputed oath. The 2 earls who governed the north, Edwin of Mercia and his younger brother Morcar of Northumbria, were young men new to their titles, leading armies raised largely from their own households rather than seasoned campaign veterans. Their father, the Earl Elfgar, had spent much of the previous decade as one of the Godwinsons' fiercest domestic rivals, occasionally allying with Welsh kings against them. His sons inherited his earldoms, but not, as the next 5 days would show, his experience in a fight. It fell to them to meet Hardrada and Tostig before Harold's main force could travel the length of England to help. Yes. On the 20th of September, the 2 armies met on marshy ground south of York, near a village called Fulford, with a ditch called Germany Beck cutting across the field between them. The only detailed contemporary account is the sea version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it describes the English mustering, in its own words, as great a force as they could get together. Even so, the account is brief. The English struck first and inflicted heavy losses, holding their own for a time. Then Tostig's forces staged a retreat. Morcar's men, seeing the invaders break and run, came down off the higher ground to chase them. It was a trap. Once the English line lost its shape, Norse troops that had been waiting out of sight came around the flank and closed in from behind. Edwin and Morcar survived. A large part of their army did not, though as with most medieval battles, no reliable body count survives. The numbers that circulate come from chroniclers on both sides with their own reasons to inflate or minimize them. There is one honest complication worth stating plainly. Historians and archaeologists still argue about exactly where this happened. The Battle of Fulford Society has spent years arguing for Germany Beck specifically, based on how the surrounding ground matches the chronicle's description. Developer-led excavations there between 2014 and 2016 found plenty of material from other centuries, and nothing that could be tied to a battle in 1066. We know Fulford happened. We are considerably less certain, 960 years later, of the exact ground it happened on. Both armies at Fulford and at the battle that followed 5 days later fought with weapons that left a physical record archaeologists can still study. The characteristic weapon of the Scandinavian invader was the long-handled axe, sometimes called the Dane axe. A broad iron blade on a haft several feet long, swung two-handed, capable of shearing through shield and mail in a single blow. Surviving examples recovered from Viking-age graves, and river finds show blades over 30 centimeters across. And experimental archaeology using reconstructed weapons confirms what the sagas describe. A skilled axeman needed room to swing, but within that room, very little could stop him. English housecarls, the paid professional corps of an earl's household troops, carried similar axes and fought in the same shield wall tradition their opponents did, because English and Scandinavian military culture both descended from the same Northern European tradition of a shield line reinforced by a mailed elite at its center. The difference at Fulford was not equipment. It was numbers, position, and a maneuver that broke the formation before the axes and shields ever had to decide the matter on their own. News of Fulford reached Harold in the south within days, and he did something no English king had attempted at that scale. He moved his entire available force from London to Yorkshire, roughly 185 miles in 4 days. Housecarls and thegns marched and rode through day and night, gathering local levies as they went, men who had no way of knowing when they woke that morning that they would be marching to a battle by nightfall. The final stretch alone, the last 7 miles from York to the crossing at Stamford Bridge, closed the gap on the invaders before they had any warning at all. Hardrada and Tostig had spent the 5 days since Fulford accepting the surrender of York and arranging hostages in no apparent hurry. Confidence, after a clean victory, is a reasonable response to have. It is also occasionally a mistake. Part of the Norse army had stayed behind guarding the ships at Rickle, along with a large share of the army's armor, on the understanding that whatever was left to do in Yorkshire could be done without it. So, on the 25th of September, Harold's army appeared on the road to Stamford Bridge. Norse accounts describe the English arriving in such numbers, and so unexpectedly, that shields glinted like a field of broken ice before anyone on the Norse side understood what they were looking at. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written in Iceland roughly 150 years after the battle, adds a parley before the fighting started. Harold, the saga says, rode out under truce and offered his exiled brother a third of the kingdom to change sides. Tostig asked what land Harald Hardrada, the far more dangerous ally, would get for his trouble. Harold's answer in the saga was 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men, a joke at Hardrada's famous height about the only property he was actually about to receive. It is one of the best lines in the whole saga tradition, and one of the least verifiable. No source written closer to the event mentions the exchange at all. Roughly a third of Hardrada's force, along with much of its mail and helmets, was still back at Rickle. There was no time left to send for it. The crossing itself was narrow, and for a stretch of the morning, one Norwegian held it alone. The near-contemporary Anglo-Saxon chronicle gives him no name and a short sentence. An Englishman speared at him and missed. Another came underneath the bridge and struck upward through the planking, and that ended it. Henry of Huntingdon, writing an English history roughly 70 years after the battle, tells a considerably larger version, a single axeman cutting down more than 40 men before the spear from below finally reached him. The gap between those two accounts is exactly 70 years of retelling, and it is worth noticing which details grew in the interval. Once the bridge was cleared, the two armies met in the open ground beyond it. Hardrada fought, by every surviving account, without armor and in a battle fury, wielding his sword with both hands. He was struck in the throat by an arrow early in the fighting and died on the field. Tostig took command of what remained and, the sagas say, refused a second offer of peace from his own brother. Then the ship guard arrived from Rickle, fully armored and led by a nobleman named Eystein Ore, in a final charge the sagas call Ore's Storm. It very nearly turned the battle a second time. It did not. By the day's end, Tostig lay dead beside Hardrada, and of a fleet that had needed something close to 300 ships to carry the invasion, 24 were enough to carry the survivors home. Casualty figures from either side, like most medieval battle counts, were recorded by the winners and should be read as an order of magnitude rather than an exact ledger. Modern estimates run to several thousand dead on each side, Both sides lost thousands. Only one side had a kingdom left to lose them in. Hardrada's goal that autumn was never really in question: collect at last on a 30-year-old promise and take the English crown his family had claimed since Harthacnut's death. Measured against that goal, the campaign was a complete failure. He did not take York permanently, did not hold a foot of England beyond a battlefield, and did not survive the attempt. But the campaign's actual significance was never about what Hardrada achieved. It is about what defeating him cost the man who did it. Harold's army had marched 185 miles, fought a pitched battle, and buried its dead, all within about a week, and it would need to do something very similar again almost immediately. There is a second thing this campaign leaves behind, quieter than a body count. The maneuver that broke Edwin and Morcar's line at Fulford, a controlled retreat that lured a shield wall out of formation before turning to encircle it, required discipline to execute and discipline to fall for. 3 weeks later, on a ridge south of Hastings, a different invading commander would use something very close to the same trick against the same style of English fighting, with a very different outcome for the man giving the orders on the English side that day. Whether William learned that lesson from Hardrada directly or arrived at it independently is a question historians still weigh rather than settle. What is not in question is that the last Viking king of Norway, dead on an English field in September, had already shown the English shield walls one repeatable weakness. Someone else was about to use it. A promise 30 years old had finally been collected in the only currency history actually pays out: consequence, not conquest. Harold buried his dead, rewarded the men who had marched with him, and had, by most reconstructions, about 3 days to rest. Then word came from the south coast. The wind at Saint-Valery had finally turned after 6 windbound weeks, and William's fleet was crossing the Channel. The army that had just fought 2 pitched battles and marched the length of England in a single week would have almost no time left to do either again before meeting him. 3 days later, William landed. Part 3: The Field.